It is my belief that all research becomes easier when we know what we're looking for. Therefore, it follows that the best way to help you to go out and create your own historical costumes or historical cosplays is to arm you with what knowledge I can. With that in mind, in this video we'll be looking at an awful lot of public domain images from Western history, and I'll be supplying as many names for the garments in them as I can, from houppelande to trunk hose to justaucorps. My name is Tilda, although I go by Woodsmoke and Words online, and I'm a costume maker, hat maker and dress historian. I studied costume interpretation at uni, and the head of our course was a dress historian, and her weekly 3 to 4 hour lectures provided the basis for my historical costume knowledge. It would be impossible to provide a full comprehensive list of the world's historical dress, and I am not an expert in every era, nor for that matter in the dress of every country. My education was sadly lacking when it comes to the historical dress of countries outside of Europe and later America. However, I will be doing my best in this video to provide you with the terminology to name some of the most common pieces found in historical European wardrobes. This is already a daunting task, and I am not knowledgeable enough about ancient times to go back and cover them in this video, so we won't be looking at the dress of ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Norsemen or Saxons. Instead, we'll be starting rather far into European history with the 12th century. The further back you go, the more unfamiliar words you will encounter. So as we progress through the ages, I will do my best to share as many historical and technical words for these garments as possible. However, these will become less prevalent as we inch towards the present day. Before we begin, I think it's important to point out that a lot of these words will be in French, either old or new. This country was of course conquered by the Normans in the 1000s, and as such, a lot of people spoke French here for a really long time. We have a lot of loanwords in our language, a lot of bastardised mixtures between French and English, and later, as Paris became a fashion capital of the West, we decided to borrow a lot of French terminology from them too, because it was fashionable and popular. So without further ado, let's get into things. I've cited every image as precisely as I can. You may want to pause the video to catch the annotations. This is the period we typically refer to as the Middle Ages. At this point in history, fashion wasn't moving very quickly. Things didn't change hugely from decade to decade as they began to in later periods. The fibres typically used at this time were wool, silk, hemp, linen, fur and leather. And these were woven into simple fabrics and fine broadcloths and expensive cut velvets and metallic cloth of gold.
Blot. A gown-like garment worn by men and women, given shape at first by cinching in the waist with a girdle and then later by lacing at the sides. Men's were shorter but otherwise differed very little, popular for about 100 years. A girdle is a belt. You'll see simple ropes and cords, woven braids, embroidered fabrics, leather and metal. They were used to control the meters of fabric and clothing to support purses, pouches, weapons or other accessories and tools. Hose, the plural of which was hosen, leg coverings made from wool and fitted to the leg by many seams. They tie onto the girdle at the waist to keep them up. These were separate garments for each leg, not connected at the crotch. This gap was covered by the longer bliots and tunics that men wore. Hose are also a term used for what we would now call socks or stockings. At this point they were not knitted or stretchy. They were made from wool, with seams used to shape them around the foot and held up by tying them under the knee with strips of fabric or cord. Sometimes they'd have leather soles and would be worn instead of shoes. Speaking of which, the infamous pointy shoes, properly named krakows, so named because the style was thought to originate in Poland. You'll also see them referred to as poulaines, which is the term I was taught at uni. This is French and comes from souliers à la poulaine, shoes in the Polish fashion, referring specifically to the point. These have been found frequently in London in men's sizes, with big air quotes, but art and historical records show them on both men and women. They reached their most exaggerated in the late 1400s. Pattens, wooden overshoes worn to lift the feet out of the muck of the street. They were worn for centuries, going by the same name. These ones here are from a detail of the Arnolfini portrait painted in 1434. Surcoat. From the French for over the coat, worn by both men and women, we associate them mostly with knights nowadays. Think the St. George's Cross surcoat worn by crusaders in a lot of popular imagery. They could be used to show a house or family's colours and allegiances. They were not always sleeveless. There were records of women wearing them in the 13th century. However, their most famous form for women is the sideless surcoat, a kind of overdress worn over the kirtle. Kirtle, also called a coat. Like the bliot, a kirtle is a gown. It is the later iteration of the bliot, really. These gowns gradually became more and more fitted, usually lacing up at the front or the sides. The fit provided women with bust support. Unlike bliots, kirtles were not worn by men. Women would usually wear more than one kirtle, one functioning as an underdress and the other as an overdress for warmth or fashion. Some had different length sleeves to show off the sleeves of the underkirtle. These could be made from wool, linen, or silk, depending on what a person could afford. Cotardie, usually associated with women, but a variation was also known to be worn by men, a kind of overrobe or dress which, unlike the kirtle, does not lace closed but buttons, to get colloquial, a bit fancier than a kirtle. Pourpoint, called a doublet in England, a close-fitting quilted jacket made to protect the wearer from their armour. Often these had points at the waist where the hose could be tied to the jacket. These are not examples of classic pourpoints, but you can see here some great examples of the points at the waist for fastening the hose. The chaperon, hood, and the liripipe. Hoods were worn by both men and women as a way to keep warm, to keep the elements off their faces, the sun out of their eyes, and to accessorise. Hoods often had long tails on the back called a liripipe. They could be made with or without buttons at the front. Sometimes they were single layers, sometimes double, with a lining in a different colour. Houppelande. An outer garment worn by both men and women that first appeared in about 1360. They might be described as a kind of coat. They have very long, flared sleeves, often with very decorative scalloped or leaf-shaped edges. Sometimes they were lined with fur for extra warmth. They varied in length. Generally women's were floor length, but men's were often shorter. Shifts and shirts. Both considered underwear, shifts were worn by women under their kirtles, a simple linen dress that pulls on over the head and protects the kirtle from oils and sweat, helping to keep the clothes clean. This was washed more often than outer clothes that were sometimes harder to launder. Shifts were used for centuries with very few changes. Shirts were worn by men under their outer clothes for similar reasons. Braise, a kind of underpants worn beneath hose to cover the crotch and backside. Veil. At this time women covered their hair unless they were very young. There are many different types of veil, but generally they consist of a large piece of linen pinned to a band or more fitted cap underneath, worn to both cover the hair and to help keep it clean. Hennin. A hennin is a cone-shaped headdress worn by women, a stiff understructure with fabric stretched over it and yet more fabric draped over it to hang down the back. Hennin is a modern word. It does appear historically, but not in reference to these headdresses. It was used to describe them in the 19th century and has stuck, therefore you may see it used for other types of headdress too. Sometimes it is applied to huge elaborate styles with multiple points, called divided hennins, although academics argue these should more accurately be called escoffions. Burgundian gown. As you may have guessed from the name, this style of gown originated in the Duchy of Burgundy and quickly spread in popularity. Identifiable by the V-shaped neckline, these were often trimmed with fur and could be made from simple block-coloured fabrics as well as far more extravagant brocades, cloth of gold, or cut velvet. Other useful terms for this era include mi-parti, parti-coloured, and motley. It was very popular to make garments that were divided and made up in different colours. For example, this pair of hose that has one half of the left leg in a dark purple burgundy colour. Often this was done with the family's colours.
What we now call the early modern period. To give you some context, in these centuries you will encounter figures such as Henry VIII, William Shakespeare, Elizabeth I, Isaac Newton, and Charles II.
Partlet. A partlet is a fabric collar used to fill in the neckline of gowns. They could be made from a range of fabrics including solid wools for warmth, decorative lattices of braid, and white linen. Sometimes they were plain or highly decorated with embroidery, often blackwork. Coif, a simple linen cap for covering the hair, often decorated with blackwork embroidery. Kirtle. In this period gowns were still called kirtles. At the beginning of the century they were much the same as they had been before, although with wider and lower necklines. However, by the 30s and 40s they began to differ in style and cut. From this point on they tend to have much more structured bodices and wider open necklines. The biggest difference is that often now the sleeves are separate and either tie, button or pin onto the shoulders, and they can be far more decorative, often coming in multiple parts such as in this portrait of Catherine Parr. Here you can also see the decorative fore-part that was used to fill in the centre front triangle of skirts. They often still laced up at the sides and front, and it was still common for women to wear something over their kirtle, although at this stage it was not always a second kirtle but a gown that was worn over the top, often of a different fabric. These were less structured and more like a kind of robe. By the end of the century the fashionable waistline had dropped to well below the natural waist. Doublet. Worn by both men and women, this sleeve jacket varies hugely in style and is popular throughout the 16th and well into the 17th centuries. At its height, it is highly decorative, slashed so that colourful lining shows through on the outside. These slashed doublets were generally made from fabrics less likely to fray, like wool and leather. Jerkin. A sleeveless jacket often worn over the doublet, or kirtle, by both men and women. Trunk hose. When you think of men's dress from the Tudor and Elizabethan eras and you think of those puffy pants, you're thinking of these. Much like medieval hose, each leg is separate and held up by being secured to the doublet with ties. The strips of fabric are called panes. You get paned trunk hose and padded trunk hose. From about 1570 onwards, you'll see less references to trunk hose and more references to breeches, also called Venetians. Canyons. Short, fitted hose that were worn beneath trunk hose. At this time, people differentiated between trunk hose and canyons and their socks by calling them upper hose and nether hose. Codpiece. A piece of fashion history that elicits awkwardness or hilarity from most people nowadays. In this era, a decidedly phallic construction that disguised the gap at the front of trunk hose, where they were attached to the waist as coverings for each separate leg. Bodies. With the first recorded pair dating from the 1590s, bodies are a bone support garment for women, the forerunner of stays and later corsets, called pairs of bodies or bodies for short. French hood. A stiff, rounded headdress that sits in an arch towards the back of the head, with a tube of fabric coming from the back to cover the hair, most commonly associated with portraits of women such as Anne Boleyn. English, or gable hood. Popular from approximately 1500 to 1550, the gable hood is a more conservative version of the French hood. As the name would imply, it holds a gable-like shape and covers the hair entirely. Originally beginning relatively simply as decorative lappets descending on either side of the face, it became a stiffer, more complex piece later in the century. It could have 1 or 2 tubes of fabric falling from the back. Atifet. A vaguely heart-shaped cap-like headdress made from wire and linen or silk, popularised by and associated nowadays with Catherine de Medici and Mary Queen of Scots. Ruff. A heavily pleated and starched band of fabric, generally white linen, occasionally edged with lace, worn around the neck by both men and women. Ribato. A shaped collar pinned to the bodice and wired so that it stands up around the back of the head. Bum roll. A roll of padded fabric worn beneath the skirts to hold them out from the body and to accentuate the hips. Farthingale. A form of skirt support, different versions existed, either a bell shape made up of gradually larger and larger hoops, or one large hoop called a drum or wheel farthingale, resting at a canted angle on the high hip that holds the skirts out and helps them hang almost straight down away from the body.
By this century, women's dresses are beginning to be called gowns. Charles II introduces the coat to the English court after returning from exile in France towards the end of the century, and clothing begins to take on far more familiar forms and shapes, particularly menswear. Once again, we begin the century with some holdovers from the previous one, but they quite quickly begin to shift in a new direction.
Stays. By the beginning of the 1600s, bodies have become known as stays. They have evolved slightly and changed in shape, but they serve the same function as their forerunner, that of a bone support garment. During this period, they are regularly worn as a garment in their own right with a skirt, particularly smooth covered stays where the boning channels are not visible. They regularly have matching sleeves which tie onto the shoulder straps. Gowns. In this era, women's dresses are not given any specific names. The styles shift from very Elizabethan holdovers at the beginning of the century to wide, rather high-waisted ensembles in the 30s and 40s, and then to long-waisted, wide and low necklines in the 60s, 70s and 80s. By the 90s, you have a new style of gown called a mantua, which we'll discuss in a moment. Mantua. In contrast to the very fitted styles previously popular, the mantua is a far more robe-like gown which relies on pleated drapery and a belt to secure the pleats in place. It remained popular into the first decades of the 18th century. Fantange. A tall, lacy headdress popularised in the late 17th century and popular into the beginning of the 18th, very much associated with the mantua. Breeches. Short trousers cut fairly close and stopping just below the knee. Now they've begun to be cut as one garment and not 2 separate legs. They button closed at the front, making codpieces a thing of the past. Justaucorps. An alternative term for a coat, adopted over here when Charles II brought the coat back from the French court in the 1660s and made it compulsory wear at court here in England. These coats were originally inspired by Persian garments. We had coat-like garments here, but they far more closely resembled longer doublets. The justaucorps was the first death knell for doublets, which men had worn for much of the 17th century. Beneath the coat is a waistcoat, which sits at a similar length to the coat itself. Occasionally, and rather oddly to the modern eye, these waistcoats also had sleeves. This is a later 18th century example, but it should give you an idea. Falling bands. A linen bib-like collar, sometimes edged with lace, that sits over the shoulders and upper chest, worn by both men and women. Periwigs, or perukes. Popularised primarily by Louis XIV and brought back to England alongside the juste du corps by Charles II in the 1660s, these were long, densely curled wigs worn by men. They often had a considerable amount of volume on the top.
And that concludes our highly condensed journey through the clothing of the past for this video. Join me next time when I will be discussing the dress of the 18th and 19th centuries. Obviously, I couldn't possibly cover everything, so if you have any further questions, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Woodsmoke and Words, and on Twitter at Woodsmoke Words. And I'll also be doing a Q&A right here on this channel at the beginning of May.